in which the Black legend continues to cast its shadow over America's Spanish past. Connecting history to current events is the absurd. This national amnesia is not news. It's glaring and supremely paradoxical at a moment when politicians warned of the threat posed to our culture and identity by an invasion of immigrants from Mexico. If Americans hit the books, they'd find out what Al Gore called an inconvenient truth. The early history of what the United States was Spanish, not English, and our denial of this heritage is rooted in age-old stereotypes and still entangled today's immigration debate. Now, whether carving out a community in St. Augustine in the 16th century, to reflecting on colonialism and liberty in the 19th, to fighting for civil rights through the courts in the 20th, Spanish-speaking peoples have made history within and beyond national borders. Now, certainly one presentation cannot comprehensively convey the legacies of everyone of Latin American origins. But given the latest preoccupation with immigration and national belonging, I want to emphasize two historical periods, which I think are really pivotal to understanding and reimagining an American narrative with Latinos at the center. 1898 and 1948. So what I want to do is I want to sort of set the context to work backwards. 1898. Now, of course, Spanish-speaking people just not suddenly appeared to the United States at the dawn of the 20th century. Now, the Spanish-Mexican borderlands were dotted with small farms, rural villages, large ranchos. For example, historian Doug Monroy emphasized that, we think of Spanish California, we think of the rancheros and the Zorro myth. Actually, only 3% of the California population in 1850 were rancheros. Most people worked for the rancheros, or they had small plots of land, or they were artisans. That's like, for example, saying that you see the Real Housewives of Orange County, you think like where everybody in Orange County lives like that. Now, with the conclusion of the U.S.-Mexican War and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Spanish-speaking settlers would confront dramatic changes in their lives and communities. If one considers Texas in the accounting, Mexico lost over 1/2 of its national domain and about 80,000 of its colonist citizens. Yet the narratives of these frontier settlers remain hidden within the American experience, overshadowed by the national implications of conquest, referred to in one textbook as the fruits of victory. Historians generally focus on the U.S.-Mexico War as Pandora's box. The fire bell in the night, the idea because it opens up the issue of slavery in the territories. And that's sort of the spark that begins to lead to the torturous path of civil war. Now, usually they'll march in the 1850s, the march to war, with maybe a little diversion to the California gold rush. But really, what happens to Spanish-speaking people who, under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, were citizens after a period of a year? People are given a choice. You can go back to Mexico, or if you stay within a year, you'll have the right to your property and enjoy all the privileges of U.S. citizenship. However, that really didn't happen, as Mexicans on the U.S.-Mexican side of the border became second-class citizens, commonly divested of their property, political power, and cultural entitlements. And of course, this dispossession did not take place in an dispassionate environment, as violence and vigilante action became commonplace. This begins the patterns of labor market segmentation, intergenerational economic stratification, and residential segregation. Now, the California elites were fully aware of their shifting fortunes as they sought to preserve their property and status through familial and business alliances with newly arrived European American entrepreneurs and professionals. The first Spanish-Mexican women to write in English in the Southwest, a woman by the name of Maria Navarro Ruiz. She really was a very astute chronicler of this decline of the ranching class in her book, 1885 novel, The Squatter and the Gold. It's a riches to rags story. In fact, though, as early as 1859, she had made the following lament in a letter to a distant cousin. Quote, "It cannot be denied that Californians have reason to complain. The Americans must know it. Their boasted liberty and equality of rights seems to stop when it meets the Californian." And she then declared, "And now we have to beg for what we once had the right to." Now, there are a number of there are a lot of fresh scholarly works now that are examining Spanish speaking women and the way in which they kind of recorded their realms in the new world. Erica Perez, a UCLA PhD. I totally recommend her brand new book, Colonial Intimacies. Also, Maria Raquel Casa's monograph. She's an undergrad alum from UC Santa Barbara. Married to a daughter of land. Wonderful, fascinating book on intermarriage that shows the ways in which women really exerted power over who would be their companions. It wasn't just their parents arranging matches. Now, concurrently with the economic, political, and cultural upheavals that are occurring in the Southwest, actually, you had many Cuban exiles in the East who embraced manifest destiny. We're like, go US, go to Cuba next. Rodrigo Lasso, who's a literary historian at UC Irvine, and is studying literary history, interrogated the publications of Cuban expatriates from the 1840s to the 1860s, whose thriving print culture in New York and New Orleans encouraged the United States to set sights on Cuba. These writers fashioned themselves as emissaries of liberation, who believed that Spanish colonialism should be supplanted by American annexation. In his book, Writing to Cuba, Lasso teased out the contradictions among Latin American intellectuals who coveted American ideals of freedom while they did acknowledge antebellum slavery and U.S. imperial designs. And even internal debates arose among this group of intellectuals. And in fact, there was even an abolitionist newspaper, El Mundo. One of the sort of leaders in this period was a woman by the name of Emerita de Valverde. She would represent exile whose views would closely represent someone we're more familiar with, who would appear on the scene several decades later, a man by the name of Jose Marti. During the 10 Years' War, people have to think that, oh, it's the Spanish-American War and Cuba gets its independence. Well, look, the Cuban people were trying for a very long time. There's the 10 Years' War in Cuba between 1868 to 1878 that was not successful. But Casanova de Valverde, during the war, wrote a letter to Italian freedom fighter Giuseppe Garibaldi, where he asserted, quote, "The beginning of our revolution means the freedom of our slaves, giving them arms and incorporating them in our patriotic ranks." Like the Grimke sisters of South Carolina, Emilia Casanova de Valverde turned away from the privileges of the family plantation and advocated for abolition. And we're just really beginning to understand her role as a rebel in her own right, apart from her husband. And there's actually a wonderful young adult fiction novel about her, done by historian Virginia Sanchez Coral, called Feminist and Abolitionist, Emilia Casanova de Valverde. Also, I would say about Rodrigo Lasso's work. His next book is forthcoming, called Letters to Philadelphia. Philadelphia with an F. What does that mean? What it means is he's found this group of Latin American exiles in 1800, in 1810, 1815, 1820, who have newspapers in New York and Philadelphia. And it's just not Simon Bolivar and his ideas of independence. They're like writing, and they're sending pamphlets, letters, broadsides, newspapers across Latin America. In fact, an editor of a Philadelphia paper, Vicente Rocafuerte, would become Ecuador's second president. So there's this sort of thriving print culture we're just getting to know about. Now, while 1848 would burn in the consciousness of Mexican Americans in the decades after the US-Mexican War, and certainly in the voices of Chicano activists a century later, 1898 would symbolize similar kinds of historic thresholds for Cubans and Puerto Ricans. Now, in the textbook that I co-wrote, we didn't call it the Spanish-Mexican War. We called it the Filipino-Cuban-Spanish-American War. The reason is because, was the war fought in the United States? No. Was it fought in Spain? No. Where was it fought? And certainly had this war, the U.S. entrance in the war had its roots in the jingoistic stories published by the First Press, and also U.S. protection of U.S. business interests in Cuba, which was about 50 million at the time, which was 1898, not a small amount. However, historians have been slow to acknowledge the role that Cubans and Puerto Ricans in the United States, the roles they played in vigorously championing the cause of independence or reign. With New York City as its primary base, Jose Marti established the Cuban Revolutionary Party in 1892. And within a short span, 40 branches appeared in New York, New Orleans, Key West, Ybor City, that's near Tampa. And then on January 29, 1895, Marti was one of 4 insurgents declared declaration of war. The war of 1895 had begun. Though he fought in battle early on in the campaign, Martí's deeds, poetry, and essays would assume a life of their own. He's revered as an apostle of Cuban liberation, and he's left multiple legacies that extended into the 21st century. Now, Jose Martí is the only person that someone who is a diehard advocate for Fidel Castro, and someone in Havana, and someone in Miami who is a die-hard exile, anti-Castro. That's the one person they have in common, is that everyone sort of reveres Jose Martí. Now, within the last, 20 years, I would say, Latin American and American studies scholars have looked to Jose Martí for inspiration, looking at really investigating the meanings in his most famous essay, Nuestra America, or Our America, in which he laid out a hemispheric vision of independent nation states in a concerted dialogue with more powerful neighbors to the north. This is what he said. The pressing needs of our America is to show itself as it is, one in spirit and intent. The scorn of our formidable neighbor who does not know us is our America's greatest nation. And the day of the visit is near. It's imperative that our neighbor know us, and soon. Through ignorance, it might even come to lay hands on us. Once it does know us, it will remove its hands out of respect. One must have the faith in the best of men and distrust the worst. Now, what Martí is calling for? Certainly say, oh, look, he's portending a century of U.S. intervention in Latin America with those phrases. But what he's also doing is he's looking at linkages. It's just not comparing. For example, when I was a student, it was sort of comparative history was in, let's compare Argentina and Brazil. Let's compare, these different countries. It's not about comparing countries. It's about fostering dialogue across countries, fostering across the connections, both within and beyond national borders. What are the conversations that take place across? Now, Martí's contemporaries, men and women who worked tirelessly toward Cuban and Puerto Rican liberation, would find their hopes dashed by the war's end. Although Cuba would gain its independence in 1902 with the caveat of the Platt Amendment, Puerto Rico would remain under U.S. dominion as, quote, a non-incorporated territory. Are we brothers at our property territory, or are we bondsmen of war and our islands a crown colony? That was a pointed question directed to the U.S. Congress by a delegation of Puerto Rican leaders in 1900. Maybe we're still asking the same question. Economic dependency on the United States would significantly cost the lives of Puerto Ricans and Cubans in the century ahead. Although there were benefits of annexation. I'm going to say his life was a totally bad thing. Although I've been criticized by some scholars by being too sunny, that I have more soul than soul. But there were benefits of annexation, which included innovations in sanitation, transportation, internal improvements, medical care. But the economic restructuring that occurred in Puerto Rico with U.S. capital investment in sugar, large corporate land holdings, and the decline of coffee resulted in massive dislocation of the island's rural people. Ignoring the impact of America's business interests, federal policymakers decided to interpret radical unemployment to one thing: they were having too many children. Overpopulation. As a result, they promulgated plans to disperse families away from the island through job recruitment or actual contract labor. For example, in 1900, over 5,000 Puerto Ricans landed in Hawaii to harvest sugarcane. They were filling a labor shortage that was caused by the Chinese Exclusion Act. And for 2 decades, more families would follow. I thought, great research saying, and there is, there's a Puerto Rican Historical Association on the island of Maui. I think that'd be a great place to do this. In 1917, with the passage of the Jones Act, Puerto Ricans became U.S. citizens. Yet for many, the free exercise of their rights proved elusive. Unlike cigar rollers in Florida, who exercised some degree of control over their labor, Puerto Rican sugar workers in Hawaii found their movements so restricted that they could not move from one plantation to another without having a written permission. By 1920, Puerto Ricans had migrated as either contract labor or free agents to 45 of the 48 states, creating communities in such diverse locales as Louisiana and Arizona. However, as historian Virginia Sanchez Coro revealed, over 60% called New York City home. Indeed, the centrality of New York as a Puerto Rican destination would resonate in the names of children born on the mainland. New Yorican, regardless of actual place of birth. If you're Puerto Rican and you're born in Oakland, you're New Yorican. As an aside, Even today, sectors of the American public consider Puerto Rican foreigners. In a profile of the 2016 Olympic gymnastics team, Us Weekly, referred to Lori Hernandez as, quote, a second-generation American with grandparents born on the island. Her grandparents are US citizens. Now, Luisa Capetillo was a passionate Puerto Rican labor leader and feminist, and she found New York certainly a hospitable place during her brief residence there. She was a veteran labor organizer in Puerto Rico and Florida, and she used her position as a lectora or reader to cultivate and reinforce the consciousness of cigar rollers on trade union issues. She would, lecture on socialism, anarchism, and at times women's rights. In New York, however, she ran a boarding house and restaurant, dishing up revolution and vegetarian fare. In her feminist manifesto, published in 1911, and by the way, it's only within the last 10 years that that piece has been translated into English. Capetillo stressed a radical vision of Republican motherhood, emphasizing women's education for their own sake and for the sake of their children. Envisioning a future of women emancipated in every respect, Capetillo declared, women are capable of everything and anything. Now, the Spanish-speaking cigar workers of Ybor City had welcomed both Jose Martin and Luisa Capetillo. And since 1886, you had Cuban, Spanish, and Puerto Rican cigar rollers and their Italian counterparts. They had creative, thriving, militant work cultures, in addition to extensive community networks. In 1892, when Jose Martin had traveled there to seek support for the Cuban Revolutionary Party, Paulina and Roberto Pedroso, Afro-Cuban community activists, offered their boarding houses as headquarters. During the 1895 war, Cubans of all colors contributed their wages, savings, and jewelry for the sake of independence. Such solidarity seems fleeting. Now, that first generation of Spanish-speaking immigrants, they had their community networks, they had their trade unions, political associations, but so they identified, they were Cuban. However, their children's sense of self became predicated on their own racial location in the Jim Crow South, where not surprisingly, Afro-Cubans developed a greater affiliation and affinity, kinship with African Americans. Afro-Latinos across generation and region confronted the color line at every turn. Linda Delgado, in her profile of the beloved journalist and civil rights leader, Jesus Colon, offered insights into the complexities of racial location in New York. For example, Jesus Colon, unlike Arthur Schomburg, Colon saw himself as a Puerto Rican man who happened to be Black, while Schomburg identified himself as a Black man who happened to be Puerto Rican. Now, this is this whole negotiation of color, of Blackness, of whiteness, of in-betweenness. This has sort of been, the imprint of these negotiations can be traced across the entire landscape of Latino history, from the borderlands to the present. I don't say something. Questions. Now, the first wave of modern immigration, and I'm just saying about the importance of color. The importance of color in colonial Latin America. Color is not something that people have learned in the United States. Color is very important, but money buys color in Latin America in a way that did not work in the United States. And we still have like the ideas. If you had sort of, someone that if you have a baby and the baby's really light, people go, ay, que chula, que bonita, and that color consciousness is still there. The first wave of modern Mexican immigration to the United States, however, also began during the 20th century. Now, in 1900, you have, depending on what demographer you believe, 300,000 to 500,000 Mexican Americans lived in the Southwest. Okay, their communities would sort of be overwhelmed because within 20 years, this figure would dramatically increase as over 1 million Mexicanos came north. 1 million Mexicanos, about 1/8 of during the Mexican Revolution between 1910 and 1920. 1/8 of Mexico's population died. 1/8 came to the United States. Now, the revolution is certainly an important sort of push factor, as well as poverty, but there are also pull factors too. Pull factors were, for example, in the 1880s, you look around the areas around Raleigh, Calexico, and you go, oh, that's the Colorado desert. We want to live there. Then you had an innovative engineer, entrepreneur by the name of George Chaffee, who basically brought water, and the Colorado Desert became the Imperial Valley. Well, they need workers. First, they put Asian workers, and then there was exclusion, and they needed more workers, and so for Mexico, railroads, the Midwest, Southwest, Midwest, they needed railroad workers. Miners, mining, copper mining, coal mining, they need Mexican labor. Now, what happens is that anti-immigrant attitudes by the 1920s was very high. And in response, the U.S. Congress passed the Johnson-Reed Act, which severely restricted European immigration and closed the door on all migrants from Asia. In the mid-1920s, this period of time is also the second coming of the Ku Klux Klan. And the second coming of the Ku Klux Klan was not just about African Americans, but it's also about Catholics. Okay, the idea that that there was a Catholic conspiracy to take over the United States. Now, while Mexicans were not subject to the new quota system, they became fodder for popular essays that emphasized their purported criminality and undesirability. The idea of the Mexican criminal, we can go back to the 1830s to Texas. I mean, it's just the recycle of stereotypes and stereotypes. America's most popular periodical was the Saturday Evening Post, and it ran a series of articles which has titles as The Mexican Invasion, Wet and Other Mexicans, and The Alien on Relief. Testifying before the U.S. Congress, one so-called Mexican expert, a man by the name of Roy Garris. He taught at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, of which at that time, I don't know that name, Latinos, but whatever. He compared Mexicans to a bowl of chili con carne, bound to give Uncle Sam a bad case of heartburn. Such characterizations are counter to the fact that Mexicans in the United States, both natives and newcomers, provided the labor for Western railroads, for the mines, for commercialized agriculture, and the building trades. Indeed, Mexican hands built the modern city of Los Angeles. For example, for those of you who go to Pasadena, like you're going to the Rose Parade, or you want to go to the Norton Simon Museum, you want to say one of those nice cafes on Lake Avenue, look at the brickwork. The brickwork, you'll see Simon's. Simon's Brickyard was the largest brickyard in the United States until about 1945. The largest brickyard, and it was a Mexican company town. There's a wonderful book by UCI professor and colleague, Alejandro Morales, called The Brick People. It's basically an autobiographical novel of him growing up at Simon's. They had a marching band, they had a hospital, they had a school. It was a paternalistic community, but the wages were good, the employment was steady, and people created communities with the company housing. Well, you know what stands now? Simon's went bankrupt. People realized it was we're an earthquake country. It's not the greatest. And the Simons died, and the family sold the property. You know what stands now in that area? Montebello. Montebello, site of the old quarry. Now, despite their contributions, President Herbert Hoover, with the deepening of the Great Depression, turned rhetoric into action. During the early 1930s, 1/3 of the Mexican population in the United States, almost 1 million people, were either deported or repatriated to Mexico, even though the majority, estimated 60%, were native U.S. citizens, mostly children. Viewed as foreign usurpers of American jobs and as unworthy burdens of charity roles, Mexicans were the only immigrants targeted for removal. They were either summarily deported by immigration agencies or persuaded to depart voluntarily by duplicitous social workers who greatly exaggerated the opportunities awaiting them south of the border. Oh, Mexico's not having depression. Removal campaigns were not limited to the western states, but actually were carried out as far east as Pennsylvania. In 1930, California's Mexican population was about 300,000, but as many as 75,000 Mexicans from Southern California returned to Mexico by 1932. That meant that almost every Mexican family in Southern California then confronted in one way or the other the decision to return to stay. In 1948, approximately 500,000 Latinos served in World War II. And this does not include the tens of thousands of people who labored in defense and other industry vital to the war effort, such as food processing. Now, the impact of the war on Latino political consciousness has been a subject of great debate among Latino historians. UC Davis historian Lorena Oropesa has asserted that their battlefield exploits would raise Mexican Americans to pursue their rights at home. But in a differing vein, George Sanchez posited that the political education of the second generation had occurred decades before they donned the military. People donned the military uniforms. Now, this is an idea in terms of my father was a veteran, served in World War II, served in Korea. This historian obviously does not have come from a military family because he says the war presented more opportunities than obstacles. Sorry. You can get killed. I don't see exactly more opportunities, but he did note that patriotic and sacrifice and service over the historian by the name of a young man by the name of Thomas Guglielmo reimbursed the patriotic sacrifice and service, only further fired Mexicans and Mexican Americans' determination to gain first-class citizenship. However, there wasn't a fiction of Latino political identity. There were two camps. One is represented by LULAC, and then the other is by El Congreso. LULAC was founded by middle-class Tejanos in 1929, and they really saw themselves as white, patriotic Americans who were going to lift up their unfortunate brothers and sisters by their bootstraps. Right? You had to be a U.S. citizen to join LULAC, and you had to speak English. They did organize successful voter registration and poll tax drives, and they did provide a lot of the legal muscle for the school desegregation court cases of the 1930s and 40s. One could say that LULAC's passive strategy or performance of whiteness was sort of an organizational version of passing. While Afro-Latinos confronted the color line in one way, fair-skinned Latinos could at times situate themselves quite lightly. According to historian at UC Santa Cruz, Gabriela Arredondo, light-complected Mexicans in Chicago could capitalize on their skin color to secure better jobs and mainstream social acceptance through access. Now, Congreso is very different. El Congreso de Pueblos de Habla Español was the first pan-Latino civil rights assembly. People came from New York, Montana, Florida, Illinois, Texas, across the country, to California, to Los Angeles. And they had, in April of 1939, 3 days where they hammered out a comprehensive platform. They were different in the jobs they held. They were different in terms of their cultural background. There were different generations. And what they wanted was an end of discrimination in education, in public facilities, in housing, in employment. And they also wanted the freedom of immigrants to live and work in the United States without fear of deportation. This was a really brave stance to think that, this was between 1934, when the immigration rates end, it's very, it's only like 5 years difference. And while encouraging immigrants to become citizens, delegates did not advocate assimilation, but emphasized the importance of preserving Latino cultures and called upon universities to create programs in Latino studies. Now, what happened in terms of LULAC? And I know, thank you very much for your patience, but I want to ask you about, two really important cases that have ramifications for the U.S. history. How many have heard of the Mendez case? Bettis versus Sharp. Oh boy, okay. Well, what happened is that both of these cases are really forerunners to the Supreme Court cases Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, and Loving versus Virginia, 1967. What happened? How Mendez sort of looks at the idea. You have to look at sort of the idea. For me, Mendez is also, it's not just a legal argument, but it's also what goes said over passing, over skin color, over privilege and Latino identities. For example, complexion counted when Latino parents went to Orange County to register their kids for school. The Weta, or light-complected Alice Esperanza Mendez Vidare, was admitted to the white elementary school in Orange County. At the same time, her Morena cousin, Sylvia Mendez, was turned away. Her parents, Gonzalo and Felicitas Mendez, sought legal redress. Now, Mendez versus Westminster is different cases. Okay, there are about 4 or 5 different cases that came together. There was Gonzalo Mendez, William Guzman, who was a veteran, World War II, Frank Palomino, Tomas Estrada, Lorenzo Ramirez. And with the help of LULAC, they sued 4 school districts. So they got these 4 separate suits. Wonderful civil rights attorney, David Marcus, was a representative. They challenged the practice of drawing school boundaries so that it showed de facto neighborhood schools. Well, you live in this area, this is your school. De facto segregation. But also, Mexicans who lived in white residential areas were also sent to the Mexican school. For example, 18-year-old Isabel Ayala was turned away when she tried to enroll her younger siblings in a local school in Garden Grove. To add further insult, according to Carrie McWilliams, who was like the predominant, sort of like the, I would say sort of like the Steve Lopez of his day, in terms of commentator, only was much more political than Steve Lopez. Carrie McWilliams, so that he called the placement he wrote was also placed on Valentine, as he wrote. Occasionally, the school authorities inspect the children, so see that the offspring of a Mexican mother, whose last name may be O'Shaughnessy, will not slip into the wrong school. Now, reading the 600-page transcript is just rife with stereotypes. The Garden Grove superintendent's bold assertion that Mexicans are inferior in personal hygiene, ability, and economic outlook, and therefore they deserve to be segregated. Also, they needed separate schools because they couldn't speak English. And also their cultural background, and I'm swear to God, I'm quoting from the transcript, prevented them from learning Mother Goose rhymes. And also the court transcript is replete with images of dirty children. In fact, David Marcus asked, do you keep a record of all the children who are dirty? And Ken said, no, not correct. Devising a two-stalled strategy, Marcus questioned the constitutionality of educational segregation and called in expert witnesses, social scientists, to challenge these assumptions about Mexican-American children and their supposed need for separate schools. When she took the stand, Felicitas poignantly pointed out the family struggles. We always tell our children they are Americans. Taking almost a year to formulate this decision, I should say that Gonzalo Mendez was a naturalized U.S. citizen. Felicitas Mendez, his wife, was Puerto Rican. Say, Paul McCormick, the judge, ruled that segregation of Mexican youngsters found no justification in laws of California, and furthermore was a clear denial of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Now, it's related to Brown in several ways. First of all, Thurgood Marshall was the co-author of an amicus curiae brief by the NAACP for Mendez versus Westminster. Second, the Mendez case influenced a shift in NAACP legal strategy to include social science concepts. Also, Judge McCormick not just relied on legal precedent, but he incorporated social science research into his ruling. Indeed, as historian Charles Wilmer notes, much of the social and educational theory expressed by Judge McCormick anticipated Earl Warren's historic opinion in the Brown case. Also, as a result of the Mendez case, in 1947, the Anderson Bill passed the California State Legislature that outlawed all forms of segregation against all groups in California schools, called the Anderson Bill. It was signed into law by then Governor Earl Warren. Now, that is versus Sharp. People really don't know a lot about. The courtship of Andrea Bettis and Sylvester Davis had all the makings of the 1940s Hollywood movie, B-movie. Pretty Rosie the Riveter strikes up a friendship with a dashing co-worker. He leaves to go fight for their country. He comes back, they fall in love, they marry, credits roll. Well, not quite, you see, because Bettis was the daughter of Mexican immigrants, and her fiance, Sylvester Davis, was African-American. Fully aware that California's anti-miscegenation code prohibited their union, they hired civil rights attorney Dan Marshall, who was a leader in the Los Angeles Catholic Interracial Council. And after a Los Angeles County clerk denied the couple a marriage license, Bettis filed suit. Now, Dan Marshall did not use the 14th Amendment in his arguments in court. Rather, he used the First Amendment, saying, look, these kids are Catholics. They want to get married. You're depriving them of their freedom of religion by refusing to allow them to get married. Now, in 1948, the California Supreme Court ruled in Bettis' favor, becoming the first state Supreme Court to strike down an anti-miscegenation. Now, we can say, yes, the 14th Amendment was quoted, Chief Justice Roger Traynor, yay. But there was actually kind of something that wasn't so great about why they decided. It was what a legal scholar, Garrett Ornstein, calls, in their decision, was called vague for vague, void for vagueness. California's anti-miscegenation law You could not apply it to people of mixed ancestry. You couldn't establish a single standard for who was white and who wasn't in the Latino community. There are too many varying shades. And because of the varying shades, it's boring. Because of my society, it's boring for vagueness. Now, at the time of the decision, Earl Warren was still governor of California, but 19 years later, he would preside as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in Loving versus Scripting their own happily ever after, Sylvester Davis and Andrea Bettis were married for over 50 years until her death of cancer. Now, Bettis versus Sharp unfolded with little fanfare. Let me tell you, the NAACP and LULAC avoided Bettis like the proverbial plague. Okay? Given their laser focus on school desegregation, NAACP leaders may have considered interracial marriage an issue that would derail their efforts. And for LULAC, some of them may share the NAACP's reservations, while others may have agreed with the LA County clerk that Bettis was indeed white. Even with the lack of support from established civil rights organizations, Andrea Bettis and Sylvester Davis demonstrated that individuals do count, and their stories do too. In the words of distinguished historian Bill Cronin, we need to remember the roots of our discipline and be sure to keep telling stories that matter as much to our students and to the public as they do to us. Or as Chicano novelist Cherry Moraga reminds us, the right to remember is a political act, one that counters an erasure from the historical record. 1948 is important because it's Bettis versus Sharp, it's the founding of the American GI Forum, and Puerto Rico becomes common. Now, Jose Marti dreamed of a new America, a trans-hemispheric union between North and South, rooted in democracy, dialogue, and equality. Quote, there can be no racial animosity because there are no races, he wrote. The soul, equal and internal, emanates from the bodies of various shapes and colors. Racism, nativism, the shape Martis remains with us in the 21st century. Contrary to popular media depictions of Latinos as people who arrived day before yesterday, there exists a rich layering of nationalities, generations, and experiences. Nuestra América es historia americana. Our America is American history. Gracias.
I know it's getting close to one, but do you have a few minutes for some?
That's what I left out.
Yes.
I wanted to get to the end.
Yeah. Any more for some questions?
Hi, Professor Ruiz. Marina Chavez from ICS Chicano Speech. Right. Working with Ali Hernandez, so she said to say hi. But I wanted to ask you, there was a moment where you were like, oh, I'll talk about that later.
What?
So I was wondering what you were going to say.
What did I say? Oh. About LULAC. Okay, LULAC. LULAC is an interesting organization. Okay, it's an organization that has been lionized, and they just do good work. It's an organization that's very narrow in terms of their perception of immigrants, and very narrow. They're very narrow in terms of their relationships with other people of color. They were it's what I refer to as the other white people. They really sort of view themselves in that way. So it's a complicated legacy. Which is going to be kind of funny because I'm actually giving an award for LULAC next time. I don't think I have to say anything. I was like, have you read my work?
So, Professor Ruiz, I know you recently retired and spending time with your grandchildren. So, are you working on anything?
I'm working on a biography, and this, I guess, of Luisa Moreno. Luisa Moreno is the most famous woman you've ever heard of. She was the first Latina to be the vice president of a major CIO union, United Cannery Agricultural Packing and Marketing with the power of long name. It was in its heyday, the seventh largest CIO union. My first book was about with the power and Southern California canneries. And I'm writing about her because she was a Guatemalan feminist, writing feminist essays as a teenager. She did Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo when she was a poet in Mexico City. She organized garment workers when she came to the States during the Depression. You know, she organized cigar rollers in Florida, pecan workers in San Antonio. She's been written out of pecan strike, by the way. I'm going to deal in the politics of that. She organized beet workers in Colorado and cannery workers in California, and of course the Congreso, and was involved in the sleeping with defense phase. She has supported my student on the grounds that she had been a member of Congress. So I knew her as a grad student. I knew her daughter. I interviewed organizers, people she worked with. I've gotten her FBI file. I've got her third husband's FBI file. She lived a very full life. And I'm looking forward, to having time actually to it's been just really